I found it. Oh, thank you.
Okay. We just have one matter we want to apprise you of, Judge, just very briefly.
Go ahead, let's go.
Okay.
May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, obviously, we're going to proceed with presentation.
Yes, sir.
All right, you're entering.
Okay, our jury's in the courtroom seated, and defendant and counsel present, please be seated. Everyone, good morning, we're ready to resume. Again, my standard question, by chance, was anybody exposed to anything about this case over the recess? I see no children. All right, thank you for your cooperation, and I'll ask the state to please call the next witness.
James Bradford. There you go, sir, if you want to step. Stand right here, face the front.
Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you give in this cause be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. Right this way, sir. Thank you. Thanks.
So please tell us your full name, and then spell both your first name and your last name.
My name is James Michael Bradford. First name spelling is James. Last name spelling is Bradford.
Thank you, please proceed.
Sir, how are you employed?
I'm a lieutenant with the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office.
What are your present-day responsibilities include in general?
My present-day responsibilities, I'm a lieutenant in the training division.
How long have you been working with the Sheriff's Office, Hillsborough County?
24 years.
Were you working with the Sheriff's Office then throughout the entire year of 2010?
Yes, I was.
And in the days immediately following the deaths of officers Curtis and Colcab with the Tampa Police Department, did the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Department assist TPD in the search for Dontae Morris?
Yes, we did.
Were you involved in some capacity in assisting in the search for Dontae Morris?
Yes.
Were you present on approximately 10:30 p.m. on Saturday, July 2nd of 2010, or approximately 4 days after the homicides, when this defendant, Dontae Morris, was taken into custody?
Yes, I was.
Did Mr. Morris, this defendant, turn himself in?
Yes, he did.
And what was that general location, do you recall?
It was at an office in South Tampa in Hillsborough County.
Thank you, nothing further.
Questions, counsel?
No questions, Your Honor.
Did this witness be released?
Yes, sir.
Sir, release your subpoena. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Please call your next witness.
Margaret Sharar.
Marcy, your witness list.
No.
Do you have a witness list for today?
No, sir, we have a total of 4 witnesses. I can advise the court and counsel. Stand right here, face your first before.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you give in this cause be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Right this way, please.
And please tell us your full name, and then spell both your first name and your last name.
Margaret Sharar. My first name is spelled Margaret. Last name is spelled Shekar.
proceed, Your Honor?
Please proceed, sir.
How are you employed, ma'am?
I'm currently employed at the Boca Raton Police Department as a biological processing laboratory technician.
Back in 2010, how were you employed?
I was employed at DNA Labs International as a forensic DNA analyst.
What were your responsibilities at that location in 2010 in that position?
In that position, I would examine evidence that was sent into our lab for any biological fluids, touch DNA, and also to obtain DNA profiles. Once I gathered that information, I would actually write reports where I would compare any of the DNA from the unknown samples to any of the standards to be able to develop statistics or else be able to exclude profiles from the unknown samples. And of course, part of my job is to present that evidence in court.
Can you tell the jury, please, your training, education, and experience in forensic DNA testing and analysis?
My training began at the University of Miami, where I obtained a Bachelor's of Science in Biology in 2005. After that, I worked at a forensics lab in Florida International University as a graduate student, where I did my own research. It was in horse genetics, but it was similar technology to what we use for human DNA. And I also worked as a laboratory technician there, doing human DNA testing and teaching graduate students, as well as laboratory sections for the chemistry department. After that, which I worked at for about 2 years, I then became employed at DNA Labs International as a forensic DNA analyst for 3 years. While I was there, I underwent a rigorous training program to learn how to actually screen evidence, how to do all the serology testing to actually test for bodily fluids such as blood and semen, as well as training on how to obtain DNA profiles and analyze the data. That training involved not just all the theoretical book knowledge, but I had lots of mock cases that I had to do and get 100% correct results on, as well as a mock trial that I had to undergo. As well as even following that initial training period, there was additional training that would happen on a periodic basis, going to conferences, and we would also do proficiency testing twice a year to show that we performed at a certain skill level.
When did you leave your employment with DNA Labs?
I left DNA Labs International in October of 2010.
And following your departure from DNA Labs, did you continue to work in the field of forensic DNA analysis?
Currently, yes, I am working in serology exclusively. It's just one subfield of what I used to do at DNA Labs International. I'm currently working at the Boca Raton Police Department, where I screen evidence for biological fluids and for touch DNA.
Have you ever testified in the courts of the state of Florida and other jurisdictions and been allowed to express an opinion, an expert opinion in the fields of forensic DNA testing and analysis?
Yes, I've testified in Florida in both in state and federal court.
Have you ever been denied such an opportunity by a court to testify and express expert opinions in this field?
No, I have not.
Your Honor, I would tender Mr. Karkar as an expert in the field of forensic DNA analysis and ask that she be allowed to express an opinion.
Any questions, Councilman?
The defense has no additional voir dire, Your Honor.
Please proceed.
In 2010, well, let me ask you this. Are you familiar with the term, it may be misused by me, traditional autosomal DNA analysis?
Yes.
Can you give the jury an explanation of what that is and how, if at all, it differs in any other type of DNA analysis that was conducted by DNA Labs in 2010?
Autosomes are most of the cells in your body. It's what's considered your skin cells, anything that's got 2 copies of your DNA, one from your mom and one from your dad. Your skin cells, your blood, saliva, all that's got what's considered autosomal cells. It's when you think of DNA profiles as a layman, it's what you're usually thinking of. Your full DNA profile, as I mentioned, you have 1 copy from your mom and 1 copy from your dad. There were other types of testing done at DNA Labs International. Mainly, there was YSTR testing. That's where we look at just the Y chromosome. So that means, only males have a Y chromosome. So if we test the sample with YSTRs, we would expect only to pick up the male portion of the DNA. So in that case, you're not testing autosomal cells. It's something that's only found, in the sperm cells. So you've only got half the amount of DNA, because with YSTRs, the male's getting that DNA from their father, basically. So it gets passed down directly just from one individual. So it's got basically half of the DNA of an autosome.
Is the YSTR analysis that was performed in DNA labs more discriminating than traditional autosomal DNA analysis?
YSTRs are considered less discriminating because you're passing down the whole chunk of the chromosome from the father to the son without shuffling the DNA the way you would with an autosomal cell. So you can follow a lineage from father to son to grandson. So it is useful in that way. But as far as the actual statistics behind it, it's not as discriminating as autosomes.
You referenced a few minutes ago a type of testing called touch DNA testing. What is meant by that?
Touch DNA, also sometimes referred to as contact DNA, it's still, you're looking at autosomes, but basically it's a low-level amount of DNA usually. It comes from when you actually touch an item. So once you've handled an item, sometimes you deposit a certain amount of your skin cells on there, and the goal of touch DNA is to be able to detect that. The only difference is that touch DNA is usually at a lower level, because it depends on how much skin you're actually shedding, how long you handle the object, whether the object had a rough surface or not. All that will determine whether you've left a decent amount of DNA there that can actually be detected through testing. And one thing that our lab did was called mini STRs. There you're still looking at autosomal cells, basically the whole DNA coming from your mom and your dad, but you're looking at smaller chunks of it because it's more sensitive. So mini STRs is another type of testing that we performed at the lab, again looking at autosomal cells. So it's just as discriminating as traditional autosomal DNA testing, and it's more sensitive.
Hypothetically, you've been sitting in that chair for, what, about 5-10 minutes already?
Yes.
Hypothetically, if you were to be done with your testimony at this moment and leave, let me start this over. Do you recall ever having sat in that chair before you took this stand today?
No.
Okay. So for the purpose of this hypothetical, if after your testimony today you were to leave this courtroom after sitting in that chair for several minutes, would you expect necessarily that you're going to have left DNA, touch DNA, on the surfaces on and near you that would leave a profile that could be detected by DNA testing?
Not necessarily. It's possible, but a lot of those factors that I mentioned previously, such as how long I've actually handled something or how roughly, because if I just put my hand briefly on the tabletop, it doesn't mean that my DNA will necessarily end up on the table, or maybe just very little of it is deposited and we can't detect it through DNA testing. On the other hand, if I touch my face and actually get a lot of the skin cells off of my face and really rub on the table, I may leave some DNA behind. So it's possible, but I don't necessarily expect a profile just from sitting here for a while.
So following up with the profile, so an absence of your DNA, would that necessarily mean you never were seated at the location you are now?
No.
Can you describe briefly and generally the steps in the DNA, mini STR DNA analysis that an analyst at DNA Labs undertook in 2010 for DNA testing?
The mini STR steps don't differ in our lab from the traditional autosomal DNA steps. Basically, you start off with a sample. Let's say you have an article of clothing and you determine that there's a stain on there that you want to test. You test the stain to see if it's blood, let's say, just because it's red and you want to know if it's blood. And you determine it's blood, so you cut out the stain into a tube. So the first step of any DNA testing is actual sample collection, which is what I just described. After that, you start the actual DNA processing. The first step there would be to actually extract the DNA. What that means is you've got cells on that little sample that you cut out into a tube, and the goal is to get the DNA from inside the cell separated from that swatch that you cut out and the rest of the parts of the cell that you don't need. So at the end of that extraction process, which is basically a purification step, you're ending up with a tube with a clear liquid usually, and inside that clear liquid you have your DNA. You can't see that with your naked eye though, so the next step would be to do a quantification step. There, your goal is to figure out if you ended up with any DNA in that extract, and if you did, how much. So there what you do is you take a little bit of that DNA extract, put it in a new tube with some chemicals, and then that tube goes onto a machine, and what it's going to do is make a lot of copies of the DNA, just certain locations that a machine will actually look at to see if there's any copies there. It compares it to known amounts of DNA where it creates basically a standard curve. If there's this much fluorescence, it means there's this much DNA, and it plots it on that curve, and it can tell you, okay, it has a certain amount of DNA. The next step is I figure out from that information how much of the sample I need to actually get a good DNA profile. So if there is any DNA in there, then the next step is called amplification. Similar to what I just described, the quantification step, where you take a certain amount of the DNA from the original extract, put it in a tube, add some chemicals, and then put it on a machine. That machine, if you have, let's say, one copy of one of your autosomal cells, and we're talking about mini STRs here, so let's say I touch the table, and then somebody comes with a swab, swabs it, puts it in a tube, and then that's the DNA extract. Even if there's, let's say, one or two skin cells on there, that amplification process, what it does is it looks at different areas of your DNA that I'm interested in, and it can make up to 1 billion copies of that one skin cell. So you make all those copies of the DNA, take a little bit of that amplified product, put it on a different machine that will detect the fluorescence, and that's where you get that raw data that gives you the DNA profile. It looks like a bunch of peaks basically, but that fluorescence is interpreted by a software, and then you end up with the DNA profile, which is telling you at these locations that I'm interested in, what DNA did you get from mom and what did you get from dad. And then it's my job as an analyst to actually look at that data and compare, let's say, the swab from the tabletop that has that unknown DNA to if I have something available as a standard for comparison. Let's say I took an oral swab from the inside of my mouth. We know that's my DNA, so I'll compare the known DNA from me to the swab from the tabletop and see if there's any commonalities. And at that point I can say, well, these profiles don't match, I can exclude this person, or in the example I'm giving, there would be a match, and what we do is we use statistics to show what the degree of the match is, how rare is the profile. So I use a software again to determine that statistic, and all that information would go into a report.
Okay. And in 2010, in DNA Labs International, were there standard operating procedures in place for the recording of the data that was generated during the extraction, quantification, amplification, and profiling process that you just described?
Yes.
Is that what can be referred to, among other things, as bench notes and the graphs and things?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Did you actually do your own hands-on testing as a forensic DNA lab analyst in submissions from the Tampa Police Department involving the deaths of officers Curtis and Kokad?
My role in this case as DNA analyst was I actually reviewed all the data that was generated by other people. So all those steps that I described as far as screening the evidence and quantification, amplification, and the DNA profiling, the actual hands-on was performed by other laboratory technicians that are trained to do these things. As a DNA analyst, I also received that training and have had lots of hands-on experience doing it. So my role in this was to gather all the information at the end of the process, review all the data, and based on the standard operating procedures, make sure that everything was performed according to our procedures, that I agreed with all the information that was presented to me as far as the testing and the results. And then I actually compiled it all into a report and actually generated the final report with the results.
The type of data and the type of information that you reviewed and relied upon in generating a report in this case, is that the type of data and results that are typically relied upon by experts in the field of forensic DNA testing to arrive at opinions and conclusions?
Yes, they are.
To your knowledge, was DNA Labs accredited in 2010?
Yes, we were accredited by FQS, Forensic Quality Services, which uses ISO 17025. It's an international standard for testing laboratories, and specifically FQS also uses an additional metric that they look at for DNA laboratories to meet even more requirements than what's required by the ISO organization. So we met all those qualifications and had the certification from FQS.
Okay, ma'am, thank you. Did you author a report in this case concerning submissions by Tampa Police Department to your lab for laboratory DNA analysis?
Yes, I did.
What was the date of your report?
It was July 7th, 2010.
Can you tell the jury what items were submitted to DNA Labs International by the Tampa Police Department that comprised the items that were DNA tested that were reported in the report of July 2010 that you authored?
Yes, for my report, we had 4 items submitted to our laboratory. We had a uniform shirt from Officer Kolcab, uniform pants from Officer Kolcab, and the standards from both Officer Kolcab and Officer Curtis.
Okay. As a result of your work in this case, did you arrive at an opinion as to whether or not there was any foreign DNA, that being DNA that was not Officer Kolcab's, on Officer Kolcab's shirt?
There was no DNA foreign to either Officer Kolcab or Curtis on the uniform shirt.
Did you arrive at an opinion as to whether or not there was any foreign DNA, excuse me, let me stop that question. When we're talking about the phrase foreign DNA, what does that mean?
Basically, I'll look at an item and compare that unknown, let's say the uniform shirt. I found a DNA profile on there. I compared it to the standards that I received, which were from both officers, and I didn't find, basically what I found matched those two standards. So it's expected, it's the officer's own shirt, so really I was looking to see if there was anything that didn't match. There was nothing that matched, so basically there's nothing foreign, nothing that isn't his, is what the report is trying to say.
So did you arrive at an opinion as to whether or not there was foreign DNA found on the uniform pants that had been worn by Officer Kokab and been tested by DNA Labs International?
There was no DNA that was foreign to Officer Colcab found on the pants.
Was there, in reference to the uniform shirt of Officer Kokab, was there blood found or indicated on that shirt?
Yes, there was blood indicated on various areas of the shirt.
And that was tested for DNA, is that correct?
Yes.
And other areas of the shirt?
We tried to find different areas. We've tested 3 different areas on the right underarm region. It was broken down into small regions because you can imagine it's a black uniform shirt. The blood's not going to be easy to see. So it's hard to determine where there was more and less blood. So what we did was it was broken up into very small regions and everything in that area was tested. We took what looked like the least amount of blood to see if there was anything else there. The blood we figured might have been from the officer, so we were looking for anything that was foreign to him that might have come from somebody else. So we tested where there was not too much blood. We tested an area on the actual badge, which was on the other side of the shirt, and beneath the front pocket.
Okay. And at all those locations there was no foreign DNA profile, correct?
Correct.
Could you tell or describe for the jury, please, what portions or samples were looked at from Officer Kokab's pants?
For the pants, no blood was detected, so we basically processed it for touch DNA. What we did was there was a swabbing taken from the front of the left pant leg, one swabbing taken from the front right pant leg, and the third swabbing taken from the front groin area, and all those were tested for DNA.
Thank you, ma'am. I would tender the witness.
Questions?
Yes, sir. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to begin by following up with one of Mr. Printer's points. Would you define foreign DNA for us?
Foreign DNA is, what it means is foreign to the person whose DNA you might expect to have on the item. So if it's an article of clothing belonging to individual A, and you expect that person A to be on the item, you process it for DNA compared to standard from person A, and that's the only thing that you find is that own person's DNA, then my report would state there's no DNA on this item foreign to A.
Okay, and I don't need to put too fine a point on this, but if you say there's no DNA foreign to Officer Curtis, you mean there's nobody else's DNA?
Correct.
Okay, no DNA foreign to Officer Kokab, nobody else's DNA.
Correct.
Thank you. You've already defined and explained to the jury, at least initially, what YSTR DNA typing methods are and how they work, right?
Yes.
Okay. And why did you elect to use this method?
It's based on just the actual quantification, figuring out how much DNA there actually is there, and the circumstances of the case. YSTRs is not usually the first line of testing, but it is useful in some situations. For example, if you've got a lot of female DNA and very little male DNA, with autosomal traditional testing, you might not pick up the male DNA, but with the YSTR testing, you can just ignore whatever the female DNA is and focus on the male. If there's a large mixture of separate males seen in an autosomal DNA profile and it's not easy to interpret that mixture, then I might follow up with a YSTR testing. I didn't see that in this case, so there was no need to go further with YSTR testing for my samples.
And you already indicated you've conducted DNA typing on the shirt and the pants and the nameplate badge?
Yes.
Okay. Did you have a correspondence or communications log?
Yes.
Okay. What's the purpose of this type of log?
The log is because we usually testify a long time after our analysis is actually conducted. The log is to keep track of if we communicate with anybody concerning the case. That way we can determine, when we communicated with whom and what the nature of the communication was.
All right. And do you have that log with you?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Could you consult it for me, please?
Sure.
And consulting your log, what was the purpose behind the efforts to type the clothing in the badge?
Well, that would be actually located on the original submission form, is where they would usually indicate what the purpose of the testing is, so I can consult that as well.
Let's consult that.
Okay, for DNA testing needs, what was requested was to swab and analyze the samples from the front of the uniform shirt, which as I described is what we did, and the front of the uniform pants. They did ask for touch DNA. As I did mention, the shirt had blood, which is why we focused on the areas with the least amount of blood, because that's where you're more likely to actually be able to detect anything that was considered touch DNA. That's basically what their request was.
Okay. And you use the mini filer method, right?
Yes.
Okay. Is that potentially more sensitive than conventional STR DNA typing?
Yes.
Okay. Did you advise the Tampa Police Department that that form of testing could potentially work for the issue raised?
Yes.
And I believe this is clear, but I'd like to make it abundantly clear for the record. Did you find any evidence for a DNA contribution that's consistent with the defendant in the uniform shirt worn by Officer Coquette?
I didn't have the DNA standard for the defendant, but I did not find any DNA from anybody other than Officer Colcab or Officer Curtis on the items I examined.
Okay. So again, no foreign DNA, no DNA that didn't belong to the officers.
Correct.
What's the cost for the mini filer STR typing and YSTR DNA typing?
I didn't do the business aspect, so I wouldn't be able to tell you the cost.
Okay. You already indicated that there is peer review, right?
Correct.
Is there an error rate?
Error rate with DNA testing is usually you're talking about the statistics. There's a confidence interval. There really was no statistics in my report since there was nothing foreign to the officers. But usually if there's a statistic, at least at DNA Labs International, it's an order of magnitude of +10 or -10. So if, let's say it's 1 in 1,000, it really could be anywhere from 1 in 100 to 1 in 10,000, yeah.
All right. May I have a moment, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
I have no additional questions for this witness.
Any redirect, State?
No, sir, thank you.
And your release, thank you very much. Please call your next witness, State.
Thomas Wall.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you give in this cause be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Right this way, sir.
Sir, please tell us your full name and this spell both first and last names.
My name is Thomas Wall, last name spelled W-A-H-L.
Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Wall. How are you employed, sir?
I'm a private forensic DNA consultant. I have my own private practice.
And what does your private practice involve on a daily basis?
A majority of my work is involved reviewing forensic DNA case files from government or private laboratories, but I also do contract work for some private forensic DNA laboratories.
Back in 2011, were you associated in some capacity with DNA Labs International?
Yes, I was hired as a forensic DNA analyst there to write DNA reports from the DNA analysis that was performed at the laboratory.
Could you tell, please, the jury what training, education, and experience you have in the field of forensic DNA analysis and testing in this field?
My education consists of a Bachelor's of Science degree in medical technology with a minor in chemistry. I began my forensic science career in 1980 with the Wisconsin State Department of Justice Regional Crime Laboratory in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and this is in the days before DNA technology. I've been in the field for 33 years now. I was there for about 5 years, and then I took a job with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement here in Tampa, and I worked here for 2 years. Again, this was before the advent of DNA technology. And after my 2 years here, I took a position with a private forensic DNA lab in Denver, Colorado, called Analytical Genetic Testing Center. In that capacity, I did DNA analysis on evidence. I worked in research in development and validation of the new DNA technology at that time called PCR technology. In that capacity, I also was an instructor. Our company did have training programs for primarily government DNA labs that wanted to learn about DNA technology because it was new at that time. And then I testified and worked casework in that capacity. And then after 5 years there, I took a position with another private forensic DNA laboratory in Seattle, Washington called Genlex. And I was hired to set up a PCR laboratory there. They did not have that capability yet in that company. And I also trained people and did some training for that company as well. And I did perform DNA analysis, and I did testify on cases when needed. And after 2 years there, I took a position with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department in Las Vegas, Nevada, and I was hired to set up a DNA lab there. They did not have DNA technology capabilities. And so I trained individuals there, and I worked the first DNA casework for the department, and I was there for 10 years. And then I retired and took a position with North Dakota State University in Farwell, North Dakota, to set up a forensic DNA lab, get the lab accredited, and try to develop a forensic science program. grant money ran out after about 3.5 years there, and so the laboratory does not exist anymore, and then I decided to go private. During my forensic career, I've had training with the FBI Quantico Research Facility in Quantico, Virginia. I've attended forensic conferences, workshops to maintain knowledge with the current state of the art of DNA technology. I'm also certified by the American Board of Criminalistics in forensic DNA analysis.
Have you testified as an expert in the field of forensic DNA analysis in the courts of the state of Florida and other jurisdictions?
Yes, I've testified half a dozen times at least in Florida, both for prosecution and defense. I am court qualified in 22 U.S. state jurisdictions. I'm court qualified in DNA in federal court, and I've testified and court qualified in Canada, the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, and the islands of St. Kitts and Nevis.
And yet you still live in Fargo, North Dakota?
Yes, it's a nice town, except for the wintertime.
Okay, sir. I'm not certain that goes to your credibility, but I'll move on. Sir, well, I would tender Mr. Wall is to express an opinion as an expert in the field of forensic DNA testing.
Questions, comments?
Defense has no additional board here, Your Honor.
Please proceed.
Mr. Wall, is there a statistical component within the field of forensic DNA analysis and testing?
Yes.
Okay. And is that statistical component involved in STR and mini STR DNA analysis and testing?
Yes, there are several statistical approaches to forensic DNA analysis that can be employed.
Back in 2011, in your capacity as an analyst with DNA Labs International, did you author a report dated March 15, 2011, concerning the DNA testing conducted by that laboratory on a number of items submitted to that lab by the Tampa Police Department during the investigation of the homicides of officers Curtis and Kokap?
Yes.
And during the DNA analysis about which you wrote your report, was there data generated and recorded by the technicians who did the hands-on testing?
Yes.
And did the machinery and the software that generated the data, did those sources also generate written and recorded data?
Yes.
Did you review that type of data generated by the work of the technologists and the software and the machines during the steps of the DNA process in this case, prior to authoring your report in this case?
Yes.
Is that the type of information and data generally relied upon by an expert in the field of forensic DNA analysis to arrive at a conclusion or opinion?
Yes.
In general terms, once two items, a known sample from a source, a human source, is compared to an unknown sample from an item of evidence, and there is a similarity of the DNA profiles, is there a statistical method that's used to calculate the frequency of that DNA match that was used in DNA Labs in 2011?
Yes, there are several statistics that can be applied, but it depends upon the data that's generated from the evidence.
Okay. Let me direct your attention to, and let's discuss then, what statistical method was used to calculate the DNA, the frequency of the DNA match in the work in this case, sir. What was the methodology used?
The statistics that were cited in my report is a statistic referred to as the combined probability of inclusion. And this statistic is applied to the data generated from the evidence when there is no clear lone source profile in the data generated. In other words, we have a DNA mixture where the contributors to the DNA mixture are present in about the same quantity. So we don't know, we can't pull out a DNA profile from a particular individual from the data. And when we have data generated like that, we apply what's known as a combined probability of inclusion. And this statistic is the probability that an individual can be randomly selected from the general population and be included as a possible contributor to the mixture.
Is that method the combined probability of exclusion?
Inclusion.
Inclusion, generally accepted in the field of forensic DNA testing and analysis when dealing with mixtures of DNA?
Yes, many laboratories will use this statistical calculation in mixture data, such as what's obtained in this case.
And have you been trained and are you familiar with the use of that statistical calculation?
Yes.
How does it occur? How do you arrive at that statistical calculation?
You evaluate the data that's generated from the evidence, and then you go to the DNA types, or referred to as alleles, that are present in the mixture, are then entered into a computer program which will calculate the combined probability of inclusion based on the DNA alleles or types that were detected in the mixture.
And are you familiar with that that computer's calculation or software?
Yes, it's a part of what's referred to as a laboratory information management system, which laboratories can purchase, and in this, it's called LIMS for short. In the LIMS system, they do have statistical programs that can be used for DNA data.
And to your knowledge, has that database contained within that software been subject to peer review and testing?
The databases that are in the LIMS system were generated by the FBI laboratory, and they have been peer reviewed and published. And a vast majority of the government labs and private laboratories use this database to generate these statistics.
And during your work over your career in forensic DNA analysis and testing, have you been allowed to testify as to the combined probability of inclusion of DNA mixtures?
Yes, many times. Mixtures are commonly encountered in forensic evidence.
If we may, Mr. Weil, let's talk about the results generated by DNA Labs International from the DNA analysis of items of evidence submitted by Tampa Police Department, about which you authored your March 15, 2011 report.
Objection, Your Honor, we approach.
First, let's talk about the standards that were presented to to DNA Labs International for the work and analysis that you reviewed and wrote your report about. Did those standards, well, what's meant by standards within this context?
A standard or a reference standard would be a biological sample that we know contains DNA that's collected from an individual to do the DNA profiling to establish what an individual's DNA profile is. And it's generally either a liquid blood sample or a swab of the inside cheek of the mouth. And nowadays, almost all reference standards are collected from the inside cheek of the mouth. There are cells that we can scrape off the inside of the mouth that have a lot of DNA, and this is a much better way to collect a biological standard versus drawing blood with a needle. It's non-invasive, and the swabs maintain their integrity for a lot longer than liquid blood.
Were standards presented to the lab and tested from the following subjects: Dontae Morris, Officer Cocab, and Officer Curtis?
Yes.
Also, were the following items submitted for analysis and the subject of your opinions, those being a black zipper identified as having been located on top of a chain link fence, a swab of a substance identified as coming from the interior door handle of passenger side front door, and a swab of a substance identified as having come from a door lock or window controls on the passenger interior front door.
Yes.
Now, of course, you would have no personal knowledge as to where they came from. You relied upon the description of the submitting agency. Is that correct?
Yes, what was reported to the laboratory by the agency.
Can you describe for the jury, please, what type of DNA analysis was conducted on these items?
The type of DNA analysis that was conducted on the evidence is referred to as STR analysis, and STR is an acronym that stands for Short Tandem Repeat DNA Analysis.
And STR, is that a form or a subset of PCR DNA testing?
PCR technology is a technology employed to do the STR analysis.
And you indicated earlier in discussing your qualifications, you had set up a number of different laboratories that used and worked in PCR analysis. Is that
Yes, I've set up 4 laboratories in my career from the ground up, the last 2 implementing and validating STR analysis.
Talk at the outset concerning the DNA analysis conducted by DNA Labs on the swab of a substance identified as coming from an interior door handle of the passenger side front door. Was a profile of DNA identified from a sample from that swab?
Yes, a partial DNA profile was obtained from this evidence and indicated a mixture of 2 individuals. So DNA mixture comprised of 2 individuals.
What does it mean when you use the phrase partial DNA profile?
In the STR analysis, the battery of tests used in this case, we have the ability to obtain 15 different DNA types, different STR DNA types, as well as the sex or gender determination of the DNA. And when you evaluate the data, you can determine how many contributors are in the DNA mixture at times. And in this case, the data supported a conclusion that there were a DNA mixture comprised of 2 individuals.
I guess I wasn't specific. What is meant and what distinguishes a partial profile from a full profile?
I'm sorry, I didn't answer the question correctly. A partial just means we didn't get DNA results from all 15 STR genetic markers, only some of them, not all of them.
what factors could affect or explain the reason only a partial profile could be obtained from a suspected biological substance in DNA testing?
There are several factors which can affect obtaining a partial DNA, and it could be one or a combination of three. One is that there's a very, very small amount of DNA that was recovered from the evidence. The DNA could be degraded such that we can't get conclusive results because the DNA is damaged or degraded. And the third possibility was there's could be a substance known as a PCR inhibitor, which inhibits the PCR technology from working.
As a result of your review of the data and work on this case, do you have an opinion as to whether Officers Cocab, Curtis, and Dontae Moore could be either included or excluded as sources or contributors to the mixed DNA profile found on the swab from the interior door handle of the passenger side front door?
My conclusion was that all three individuals are excluded as a contributor to the DNA mixture.
Let me move on, if I may, sir, to the analysis conducted upon the swab of the substance identified as having come from the door lock, window controls on the passenger interior front door. Was there blood detected on this item?
No.
What is Y-DNA, sir?
Y-STR analysis is an STR analysis of genetic markers or types present on the Y chromosome. Therefore, the Y-STR analysis only generates data from DNA from a male individual. Females do not have a Y chromosome, so therefore, even in DNA mixtures with female DNA, if you perform Y-STR analysis and you get results, those results can only be attributed to a male individual.
Was a DNA profile obtained from the swabbing from this location at the door lock and window controls of the passenger?
Are you referring to a Y DNA profile?
I'm talking about a profile in general.
Y DNA STR analysis was performed, and there was no results obtained. And then we did what's referred to as autosomal DNA typing, which is not Y-STR typing, which both male and females can be typed with that. And there is a indication of a mixture of at least two individuals, and one of the individuals is a male. And furthermore, a major contributor could be ascertained from the mixture data. And what I mean by that, with some DNA mixture data, there may be DNA present in the mixture from an individual in what's referred to as a predominant form. In other words, there's a lot of DNA from one individual in the mixture relative to the other sources of the mixture. And when you have data like that, you many times can pull out the DNA profile from the major contributor. We actually know what their DNA profile is. And in this case, there was a major DNA profile that could be ascertained from the mixture data.
As a result of your review of the data generated during the DNA testing in this case, did you arrive at a conclusion or reportable opinion as to whether Officers Curtis and Cocab and Dontae Morris could either be included or excluded as contributors to this mixed DNA profile?
All three individuals are excluded as a contributor to the mixture, and furthermore, this major profile that could be determined from the mixture, in my opinion, is attributed to a female individual, and the minor component is from a male.
Moving on to an item presented or submitted to DNA Labs International by Tampa Police Department and identified as a black zipper located on top of a chain link fence. Was DNA testing conducted by that laboratory back in 2011 on this item?
Yes.
Was blood detected on this item?
No.
What type of, was a DNA profile obtained? From
Yes,
this item?
a DNA mixture profile was obtained.
Using what form of DNA testing?
The STR autosomal testing, not the YSTR testing.
And what opinion do you have as to the contributors to that mixture as it relates to Officers Curtis, Cocab, and Dontae Morris?
Well, first off, the mixture contains at least 3 individuals in the mixture. And Officer Cocab can be excluded as a contributor to the mixture. Officer Curtis cannot be excluded. In other words, he's included as a possible contributor to the DNA mixture. And Dontae Morris also cannot be excluded, or they can be included as a possible contributor. So Officer Curtis and Dontae Morris both could be possible contributors to the DNA mixture.
Were you able to arrive at an opinion using the combined probability of inclusion statistical method to form an opinion as to the statistical relevance of the inclusion of Dontae Morris as a potential contributor to this mixture?
Yes, with this mixture data, there was no major or component that could be ascertained from the mixture. Therefore, we applied the combined probability of inclusion to the data. And I performed that calculation from the data generated from the evidence.
And what was your conclusion, sir?
With Officer Curtis, the combined probability of inclusion is approximately 1 in 10 individuals. And with Dontae Morris, approximately 1 in 13 individuals.
Okay, Mr. Wall, I'm going to ask you to explain what that means in layman's terms, that those numbers pertaining to Dontae Morris, that the possibility of inclusion is 1 in 13. Can you give us some guidance in that regard?
Yes, if in this courtroom today, I don't know how many people are here, but 1 out of every 13 people in this courtroom could be included as a possible contributor to this DNA mixture.
So, assuming for the sake of this hypothetical that the Hillsborough County area had approximately 1 million inhabitants, how would that these odds translate in terms of how many people could likely have been a contributor among those 1 million inhabitants, approximately?
I have a calculator on my smartphone. I can do it for you real quick.
If you would, sir.
You asked the 1 in 13 is what you asked?
Yes, sir.
Approximately 77,000 people could be included as a contributor to the DNA mixture in the Hillsborough County area.
So would it be correct to describe that partial profile that includes Dontae Morris in this mixture as common?
There's a subset of the population in Hillsborough County that could be included as a contributor, and it's not a significant number, if that's what you're asking me.
And can you tell the jury why the statistical probability of inclusion would be so low, essentially?
Several reasons, if I may refer to my notes.
Yes, sir.
It could be that there's a limited amount of genetic information that was obtained from the mixture data. Partial profiles, for example, we don't have a complete genetic information from all the battery of testing. It could be there could be some degradation that's of the DNA, such that we weren't able to get conclusive results from some of the STR regions that we test. And the other reason, in my opinion, probably the most likely reason, is that we were only able to recover a very small amount of DNA from the evidence. And when you only have a very small amount of DNA recovered from the evidence and you do STR analysis, sometimes, many times you obtain very limited genetic information. So you aren't able to exclude as much of the population as you normally would with more genetic information. So you would include more people in the population based on the limited amount of DNA information.
And did you arrive at an opinion or conclusion as to the combined probability of inclusion of Officer Curtis within this DNA profile mixture?
Yes,
And what was that, sir?
approximately 1 in 10 individuals.
And could those numbers have been affected by the similar factors that you just described in your last answer?
Yes, the DNA from the evidence could be affected by those factors.
All right, sir, a hypothetical question. You've sat in that chair for approximately half an hour. Have you ever sat in this precise witness testimony chair before?
Many years ago, when I worked at FDLE, I was in this courthouse. I don't know if I was in this particular courtroom, but
Okay, and what was it, 1970s, 80s?
between 1986 and 1988,
Okay,
when I was a lot lighter and didn't have white hair.
If at the end of your testimony you left that stand, would you necessarily expect to find your DNA on the surfaces of that witness stand that could be, from which a DNA profile could be obtained?
Not necessarily, no.
And what type of factors could affect that?
The main factors are how many cells would be deposited from my body on a substance through direct contact, either sitting or handling an item.
May I have a moment, please, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Wall. No further questions.
Questions, counsel? Questions? Thank you.
Good morning, sir.
Morning, sir.
I would like to follow up on some of the points made by Mr. Pruner, but do you have a table of the testing available to you?
Yes.
So- Oh, I apologize. Is that better? If I get closer to the microphone, is that a little louder?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks. Okay. At D21,
Yes.
are you there? Okay.
Mhm.
The defendant, Mr. Morris, is labeled as a 28/33.2.
28/33.2?
Yes.
Yes.
Is that correct? All right. Did you detect a 33.2 on the black zipper?
I did not detect a 33.2 above 100 RFU threshold.
Very well, sir. And just so I can use a statistical and mathematical construct that won't require your calculator on your smartphone, given the number of people in this courtroom, would you estimate roughly that 2 to 4 individuals could be included?
Are you basing that on what, 50, 60 people?
That sounds about right.
That sounds about right, yeah.
Okay. And so looking back at the processing of that black zipper, is there any part of the procedure, or has there been a change in the procedure that you used in 2011 that you don't use now?
For STR analysis,
Yes.
the procedure would be, to my knowledge, would be the same. The processing of the evidence, extracting the DNA, quantifying it, and applying it to the DNA analysis would be the same.
Okay. Was there any changes regarding the use of reamplification?
Changes in reamplification?
Yes, sir.
The only change in reamplification is whether an analyst decides they want to try to use more DNA to amplify with the PCR technology in order to get a result they can report out. Or There may be indications of a PCR inhibitor where they can clean up the DNA per se and then re-amplify it to see if they've removed the PCR inhibitor in order to get a result.
Yes, sir. All right. And with respect to both Officer Curtis and to Mr. Morris breaking it down one individual at a time, of course, your report indicates that you were able to detect an STR DNA typing pattern for the black zipper, correct?
Pardon, I didn't hear you, sir.
The report you generated indicates you were able to detect an STR DNA typing pattern for the black zipper.
From the black zipper?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
All right. And it indicates that the defendant cannot be excluded, and you've defined that, correct?
Correct.
And that the chance that an individual chosen at random from the general population would be 1 in 13.
That is correct.
Okay. And you've already agreed with me that that would be perhaps 2 to 4 individuals in the courtroom as well.
Yes, if the courtroom represents the general population, which I do believe it does, yes.
Thank you, sir. If I may have just a moment, Judge. No additional questions for this witness, Your Honor. Thank you, sir.
Redirect.
No, sir, thank you.
Sir, your release, your speaker, thank you very much. Thank you. State, please call your next witness.
State calls Lisa Johnson.
May we approach, Judge?
Yes, sir. Our jury's left the courtroom, will be in recess till 10:05.